Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would do this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video by the boxing channel known as Dante's Boxing Nation. And this video is going to be about Mr. Silva Canelo Alvarez. And recently, and maybe this wasn't even that recently, I'm not necessarily sure, another all time great fighter by the name of Andre SOG Ward. And basically, what Andre Ward stated about Canelo Alvarez after his Dimitri Bivol loss, he stated the truth. And Andre Ward oftentimes, in my view, does state the truth. And the people that I notice that usually don't tend to like Andre Ward or Floyd Mayweather Jr. after they tend to speak the truth overall, especially after certain fighters, whether they win or whether they lose, is usually the people like Dante's Boxing Nation. And basically, what Andre Ward said about Mr. Sewell Canelo Alvarez is that he still believes that Mr. Canelo Alvarez is a great fighter and that he does deserve to still be on the top 10 pound per pound list, even though, in his opinion, Canelo Alvarez can no longer be the number one pound for pound fighter after a loss. And I pretty much agree with everything that Andre Ward said. And let me state this here, because a certain amount of people may disagree with what I just said. And I may have certain Canelo fans, they may overall try to tell me, and they say, well, Canelo, he did move up in weight and try to achieve greatness by defeating that, or trying to defeat that of a Dimitri Bivol, one of the best fighters in the world, and also someone who is clearly bigger than him. Why would you still not have Canelo Alvarez as your number one pound per pound spot? Because of his fantastic resume. And I do believe that Canelo does have a fantastic first ballot, not even just A grade tier. I think that Canelo Alvarez has a S grade tier resume with all the champions that he has beaten. But that is the rule on my top 10 pound per pound list. I don't care what fighter you are. I don't care overall if you're Vasily Lomachenko. I don't care if you're Canelo Alvarez. I don't care if you're Floyd Mayweather Jr. I don't care if you're Manny Pacquiao. I don't care if you're Roberto Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roy Jones Jr. I don't care who you are. Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, Julio Cesar Chavez. I don't care who you are. You cannot be the number one pound for pound fighter coming off of a loss on my list. It just is what it is. And I like Canelo Alvarez a lot. I think that he is an extraordinary talent. I think that he is an extraordinary fighter, probably one of the greatest fighters, probably one of the top 3 to 5 greatest fighters that I've seen personally, at least when I started watching boxing. But Canelo Alvarez, in my view, cannot be counted as the current number one pound per pound fighter coming off of a loss. That does not mean that he is not within my top 10 pound per pound right now. He's within my top 5. But Dante's Boxing Nation, as usual, because he does not like Canelo Alvarez, because he never really has liked Canelo Alvarez, and he especially has not liked Canelo Alvarez within these past few years, the same reason why he does not like that of a Tyson Fury or a Vasily Lomachenko or a Gennady Triple G Golovkin or other certain fighters that may grace the top 10 pound per pound list that basically does not have the complexion for his protection. So it just is what it is. And Dante has basically been trying to make these videos for the past few years, especially basically trying to allege that the only reason why Canelo Alvarez was ever ranked as the number one pound per pound fighter was just because he had the complexion for the protection and boxing was so racist. And don't get me wrong, are there certain boxers or are there certain fighters that may be placed on the pound per pound list in certain spots because they may not want black fighters overall on the list, or they may want to make it seem like the black fighters aren't as dominant? You can maybe debate that when it comes down to it. Like a Naiwa Inoue, for example, even though certain people would disagree. I think overall that is a certain way, not only to give him credit, but also to connect with that of the Asian market. But when it comes down to it, if you're going to allege something, I do think that you have to have somewhat of validity towards it. And I think you have to have some sort of logic and objectivity and some sort of point that actually makes sense with some rationale. And to say that Canelo Alvarez, someone overall who has defeated champion after champion after champion, and pretty much A grade champion after A grade champion, with almost a dozen A grade champions that he has fought in his career, to just say that Canelo Alvarez was ranked as the number one pound per pound fighter just because of alleged blatant racism, no, I don't think that you can allege that, sir. But Dante, of course, is going to allege that. He's been alleging that for the past 3 years, and he's very pissed off at Andre Ward when it comes down to it because he did not stay on code, at least for him, for his pro black mentality. So it is what it is. But, anyways, we're going to see what Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation has to say. Let's get into it.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So when Mexico's own president of the WBC, Mauricio Suleiman, came out and said that Canelo Alvarez is still number one, the best fighter in the world, right after getting completely dominated by Bivol, him saying this about Canelo Alvarez, it wasn't really surprising. That's why I didn't make a video about it. I mean, let's not forget, this is the same guy who defended Canelo Alvarez for testing positive for steroids, PEDs. So while it's extremely expected for the WBC president,
Yes, and I do remember when Canelo Alvarez was caught on PEDs, and I did not defend Canelo Alvarez, but of course, once again, I'm not a fanboy of any of these fighters. But to use overall that, and certain people may say, well, since he was caught on steroids, I can't have him as my number one pound for pound fighter. Well, I don't necessarily have a problem with that rule. But if you're going to use that rule, then you're also going to have to use that rule with several other fighters throughout the history of boxing or throughout the history of sports. You're also going to have to use that with Mr. John Jones if we talk about the UFC. You're also going to have to use that with Roy Jones Jr. You're also going to have to use that with Manny Pacquiao, Sugar Shane Mosley. And now some people may say, Manny Pacquiao, what are you talking about? He's never been officially caught. Well, in my view, more than likely one way or another, the way that he was able to move up the weight divisions, he probably was on something, but it is what it is. Because in my view, you can never really tell which of these fighters are on them and which of them are not. Another fighter that I believe probably was on them at one point in time, Juan Manuel Marquez. So once again, if you want to discredit Canelo Alvarez, you can go ahead. But once again, the steroids to me, that they're only marginal because there's so many athletes today that I believe are really on steroids anyway. I personally believe that top of the notch athletes like Serena Williams, LeBron James, and certain football players that maybe overall, I am not mentioning Aaron Donald. I believe that certain athletes even like that are debatably on steroids. So it just is what it is. Pretty much anyone in the NBA or anyone in the NFL, or at least a certain amount of them, not every single one, but a certain amount of them. I believe that a lot of these guys or gals may be on steroids depending on the sport. Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, they may potentially be on something. I'm a believer that a lot of these athletes are on steroids anyway. So to me, the steroids, unless you have been caught so many damn times, to me, it's not really a huge penalty. Unless maybe you're someone like a John Jones or someone of that sort. But anyway,
to say extremely ridiculous, biased things towards Canelo Alvarez, Andre Ward's reaction to what the president said was actually a lot more interesting. Andre Ward, he said, I do agree with Mauricio Suleiman that Canelo should not be dropped completely from the pound for pound list because of a loss. Canelo has put in too much work and he didn't get blown out. But you can't hold the number one spot after a loss. Too many great fighters deserve to be on the list. Someone responded to Andre Ward by saying the fight wasn't competitive, but I agree with the second part of what you said. Andre, he responded by saying, I'm going.
well, I would agree that the fight was not super duper competitive, but what I would say is that a fair score would have been 8 rounds to 4 for Dimitri Bivol. And when you factor in, not only does Canelo Alvarez have all the belts at 168 pounds right now, but on top of that, Canelo Alvarez, he does probably have the best resume all current boxing right now, at least out of any active fighter that is within their prime. He certainly does still deserve to be on my top 10 pound for pound list, no doubt about it. Is Dante going to agree with that? No, because Dante did not even want to put him on the top 10 pound per pound list before he lost to Dimitri Bivol. So it's no offense against Dante, but I can tell the difference between someone, all in all, well, I'm not saying that he does not somewhat believe in some of the stuff that he says, but some of the shit overall he says, there's no way that you can tell me that he knows overall or that he doesn't know how biased that he's being. Is no offense, but I can tell someone overall who's trying to, feed me some logic and objectivity and who's trying to, spoon feed me a spoonful of shit. It just is what it is. And Dante, he is not logical. He is not objective. Keep in mind that this is the same person that alleges that Terrence Crawford, that he was facing A-grade competition, by facing Mean Machine and Jeff Horn and Jose Benavidez, who are all pretty much C-grade fighters. And then, of course, he said the same thing about Gervonta Tank Davis when he fought that bum off the street, Rolly Romero, and then also fought Isaac Pitbull Cruz, two fighters who have never been champions in their life. So once again, what is really going on here? what are really his true machinations.
Off the scorecards. I'm not getting into the weeds about what I had at score. When I say blowout, I mean he wasn't knocked out without putting up a fight. Let me start off by saying this. Andre Ward is definitely right when he says you can't be considered pound for pound number one when you just came off of a loss. There's way too many great fighters on the list. All of that made sense. But what I really didn't understand, well, there's a couple things I didn't understand. First of all, why did Andre Ward say, but I do agree with Mauricio Suleiman when it comes to Canelo Alvarez still being on the list? Why is Andre Ward saying, I agree with him when it comes to that, when Mauricio, he never said Canelo Alvarez should still be on the list? Mauricio said Canelo Alvarez, he should be considered number one, the best fighter in the world. So why is Andre Ward going out of his way to say, I agree with the WBC president, when in all reality, the WBC president, he didn't say anything that Andre Ward agreed with. Andre Ward just put words into his mouth and he overcompensated.
Well, I somewhat get what you're saying, but at the end of the day, I think Andre Ward was just trying to be polite. But I do believe that he did speak the truth, at least from his perspective, which is that Canelo Alvarez still does deserve to be on the list, which I fully on agree with. Now, if you're talking about a fighter recently that lost not that long ago, even though he does have a decent resume, that I don't think should be on the pound for pound list anymore, that would be someone like a Vasily Lomachenko. But Canelo was not only a four-weight division champion and has been completely unified in a division, but he has fought repeated A-grade level caliber fighters. So Canelo still has to be on the list.
By saying, I agree with him that Canelo should still be pound for pound on the list. The conversation was never about if Canelo Alvarez should still be on the list. That's a different conversation. But this is the problem with a lot of black fighters today. They feel if they say something that is perceived as negative about a fighter who's not black, even when they're telling the whole truth, they have to come back and give them some type of consolation prize. They feel they have to go out of their way to balance things out since they just said something about Canelo Alvarez.
Well, you wouldn't really know the truth, Dante. If it bit you in your big dumb ass, it just is what it is. Dante, and it's no offense against him. I got no personal problems with these guys. But at the end of the day, no, I'm sorry, sir. I cannot agree with your narrative. Basically, you're pretty much pissed off, with Andre Ward because he is not going according to code overall the way that you want him to. He is not saying the things that you want him to. And basically, overall, he is telling the truth. And that's what some of the best boxers and most logical and objective boxers have done. It's also the same reason why Dante was so pissed off at certain fighters, certain black fighters especially, overall, who did not go with Deontay Wilder in the Tyson Fury trilogy. In the Tyson Fury Deontay Wilder trilogy, excuse me, when many of them said that they did not believe that Deontay Wilder got cheated, he basically took a look at them and he said, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you not going with Deontay Wilder? But Dante doesn't understand that because Dante really doesn't know what it's like to be logical and objective because he thinks like a damn woman. It just is what it is. Dante is very highly emotional, so he doesn't really operate on a higher level of intelligence. He doesn't really get overall what it is to be logical and objective. So if you don't go overall according to code and with one of his fighters, he's going to take that as a personal attack. And that's how you know that you cannot rely on him for an objective overall analysis. It just is what it is.
Yes, that maybe the boxing world doesn't want to hear, regardless if it's true or not. This is exactly why Clarissa Shields, she came out right after Canelo Alvarez lost and she posted something saying, stop hating on Canelo Alvarez. But since when do we hear people saying, stop hating on the actual loser? Wouldn't it make more sense to say stop hating on the winner?
Did you not say that about Mr. Deontay Wilder? When Deontay Wilder ended up getting his ass kicked against Tyson Fury? And did you not also make 72 different excuses? Once again, let's not be a hypocrite here, Dante. Okay, one thing that annoys me so much about some of these channels is they always basically love to say about how certain, people make excuses or this or that. But then when it came to Deontay Wilder, you should have heard some of the dumbass excuses these guys were literally making. I mean, everything from the water was drugged overall to, egg whites in the glove, just all this stupid shit. All this shit just to overall act like pretty much any other over emotional ass fanboy in the sport. Is what it is.
When some fans are trying to make excuses or take credit away from the win, I mean, just think about it. After Shakur Stevenson beat
Well, let's also be real. Mr. Devin Haney is a prime example. There was a lot of people on the know that stated recently that, they were not giving Devin Haney credit over his win over George Kambosos because he was nothing but a runner and he was nothing overall but a boring fighter. And one of the fighters that did come out and say something, Dante, was Mr. Timothy Bradley. So let's just not sit here and act like there's just no fighters or no black fighters that basically defend black fighters. Now, are there certain black fighters maybe that you can debate do not, necessarily compliment black fighters maybe as much as what they should, or maybe even some of them seem to have a little bit of jealousy, or maybe some of them are company men. You can maybe make that case. But there's a bunch of black fighters that overall said that they believe that Canelo Alvarez is an all-time great fighter. You have Javante Tank Davis that said it, Shakur Stevenson that said it, Devin Haney that said it. You had even both of the Charlo brothers that ended up saying it, and they're near his own weight division. So, Clarissa Shields said it as well, who, of course, is a woman boxer. You had Timothy Bradley, I believe, say it, Andre Ward. All these black fighters, Mike Tyson as well, all these black fighters overall can't just be company men or afraid to share their opinion. Like, come on.
Oscar Valdez, he said,
They talk about Canelo Alvarez in the same way that a lot of basketball players from the 80s talk about Mr. Larry Bird. If you hear Isaiah Thomas and Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson talk about Larry Bird, many people who did not watch basketball back then, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I did because I was not born then. I was born in the 90s. But, anyone who knows a little bit of information about Larry Bird, he was an all time great player, one of the most complete players in NBA basketball history. And there were certain people that once believed that even Isaiah Thomas, who was one of the great point guards back in the day, back in the 80s into the early 90s, won 2 championships with the Detroit Bad Boy Pistons. He once upon a time agreed with Mr. Dennis Rodman, who was another all time great player, at least defensively, that the only reason why Larry Bird was counted as great as what he was because he was a Caucasoid player, or that because he was a Caucasian player. And if you take a look at what they say today, they completely, they do not agree with that. Now, some may say, well, maybe they got scared into it. No, they realized that Larry Bird was greater overall than what they once originally thought. And Canelo Alvarez overall is a very, very similar, thing. They realized that Canelo Alvarez is an all-time great fighter. Because these guys, like Dante, they always try to sit here and act like Canelo Alvarez, like he's never fought an elite fighter in his life. Canelo Alvarez not only has fought elite Caucasoid fighters, like that of a Caleb Plant, a Billy Joe Saunders, a Callum Smith, and maybe even a couple of others that I'm not personally thinking of, a Sergey Kovalev, even though he was a little bit more wore down in his career. He's also fought elite Latino fighters and black fighters. He fought Arasani Lara and Gennady Golovkin. I forgot to mention him. He fought Arasani Lara. He fought Danny Jacobs. He fought Austin Trout. The only 2 black fighters that he really has not fought within his career have been Jamal Charlo, who, to be quite honest with you, is not on the same level as an Arasani Lara. He really may not even be on the same level as a prime Danny Jacobs. I would say that maybe he's about there, but nothing really, in my view, has really ever popped off the screen with Jamal Charlo. And if you don't believe me, watch his fights against Austin Trout and Matt Korobov, and you tell me that that's a fighter that's going to defeat Canelo Alvarez. You say that with a straight face. It's just, you tell me. Okay? And Demetrius Bobo Andrade, I think that he's a very decent fighter, but he really has never really popped off the page for me either. Now, some people would disagree with that, but that's just my view of him. It just is what it is. But Canelo has fought many all-time great fighters, or at least many great fighters. So it is what it is. And that's not even mentioning Miguel Cotto, even Chavez Jr., if I want to mention him, even though he's never really been that great of a fighter. And there may even be a couple of others that I'm not mentioning.
man, I'm receiving a lot of hate. He was like, the hate is real. Because, see, before Shakur Stevenson beat Oscar Valdez, he actually said, after I beat Oscar Valdez, I'm going to be loved, I'm going to be a star, etc., etc. But since the majority of these black boxers...
Did Shakur Stevenson really say that he's going to be loved and that he's going to be accepted? Listen, there are just certain boxers whether they be black boxers or whether they be whatever. Haters are always going to be haters. And listen, are there certain black boxers that especially have to deal with maybe more double standards at times? You can certainly debate that. But listen, at the end of the day, let's not sit here and try to argue that the only reason why these black boxers compliment Canelo Alvarez is because they're just afraid to share their true opinion. Like, come on. Terrence Crawford, Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, Jamal Charlo, these are all black boxers. Andre Ward, these are all black boxers or somewhat of the black demographic, maybe mixed like that of an Andre Ward, who have said something about Canelo Alvarez one way or the other. And they all have still complimented him in some way.
Are completely oblivious to the racial double standards that are right in front of their face in the sport of boxing every
They're not oblivious to the racial double standards, Dante. They're not stupid. Don't try to pull that narrative. You are basically insulting all the black boxers' intelligence by basically stating that, and you're also insulting their individuality or their courage. Then now, don't get me wrong. There are certain black boxers or black athletes that may be afraid to speak out, maybe, but a certain amount of them overall are not afraid to speak out. Terrence Crawford has spoke his mind. Shakur Stevenson has spoke his mind. Let's not forget that Terrence Crawford and Shakur Stevenson literally alleged just a few months ago that they believe that Bob Arum has a racial issue. All right, the president overall of the Top Rank, he is the CEO of Top Rank. So let's just not, do this bullshit of, oh, they're completely oblivious to the racial double standards. That makes no goddamn sense. Okay? Anyway.
Hey, they're actually shocked. They're completely surprised when they get these big, huge wins, and the same race fans that were giving them no credit before the win are still not giving them any credit or not even congratulating them after they get the win. They're still receiving the same type of.
I agree with you there, Dante, but you basically saying that is like calling the pot, once again, the pot calling the kettle black. But anyways, when it comes down to, because once again, we all know what Dante usually says whenever Canelo Alvarez does something, or whenever Vasily Lomachenko or Alexander Usyk or Tyson Fury does something. Once again, I'm not in here to talk about feelings, folks. It is what it is. I get some of these fans from some of these channels, they come into my videos and they're like, oh, you're just hating when it comes down to, Dante just speaks the truth. Every point that I have can be backed up with some sort of logic or facts. I have several different points, usually to every single thing that I say. I have some sort of data or some sort of facts behind it or some sort of logical reasoning. And I've been saying this now for the past couple of years, especially ever since I've been doing videos. It's very obvious if you're an intelligent person or intelligent enough to see what's going on here that Dante is not logical. He's not objective. He has a very big racial issue. Is it a coincidence that a lot of the fighters that are either Caucasoid or Latino fighters you have a big issue with that seem to be put within the top pound for pound list, you seem to have a problem with every single one? You seem to have a problem with Canelo, Vasily Lomachenko, Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk. The only one you don't seem to have a problem with is Josh Taylor, who could potentially be, whooped by Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. That's the only Caucasoid fighter you don't have a problem with. It does not take a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist to see what's going on here. Now, don't get me wrong. Is it, necessary to call out also the double standards against that of black fighters? Yes, it is. But listen, at the end of the day, don't sit here and try to spoon feed people this bullshit about, oh, how Canelo Alvarez is only looked at as a great fighter because he's a Caucasoid fighter. No, Canelo's looked at as a great fighter because he's an all-time great fighter. Okay? So it is what it is.
Racist comments. In fact, the bigger the win is for a fighter on the coincidental list, usually the worse the reception is from these race fans on the internet. So the point is, Clarissa Shields, she should have been posting videos telling people to stop hating on Shakur Stevenson because he's the.
Has Clarissa Shields now talked about the double standards of race? I'm pretty sure I've heard her several times talk about something like that. But maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Maybe I'm in the wrong here. I don't know where Dante gets this narrative from, spoon feeds people this shit of how no black boxers are just talking out. Like, dude, what are you talking about? Just a few months ago, once again, both Shakur Stevenson and Terrence Crawford, even Devin Haney, I believe to a degree, all alleged some sort of racial issue. So it's like, what the hell are you talking about?
On receiving the hate. If a black fighter lost, you would never hear people coming out saying, stop hating on him because he lost. And you certainly.
Many people have done it, Dante. That makes no goddamn sense. Timothy Bradley, when Devin Haney overall just recently said overall, that Devin Haney, that he put on a great fight and that people should stop complaining. All right, so it is what it is. So stop your bullshit when it comes down. And now, don't get me wrong. Does that mean that every black fighter does it? No. Does that mean that some of Dante's points that they may not be relevant to certain fighters? No. But when you're trying to make the point that the only reason why people overall don't speak about Canelo Alvarez, is because he's a Caucasoid fighter and people want to protect him, like just stop. Canelo Alvarez has clear credentials. It'd be different if he was someone like a Mikey Garcia or a Javante Tank Davis, to where he never fought an A-grade fighter in his life. But Canelo Alvarez has fought so many A-grade champions throughout his career, undefeated as well.
Wouldn't hear it from black people because black people, they know the majority of fans that are racist don't want to hear that. These black fighters only want to say things that they feel is accepted. In other words, they want to say the thing.
So when Terrence Bud Crawford said that Canelo Alvarez, he said something, he said that he's ducking elite black fighters. So Terrence Crawford, he was worried about the racist fans when he said that. Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, and all those guys, they said something about race, racial double standards, because they thought all in all that they were going to be accepted by the racists. Dante, that makes no goddamn sense. I don't think that you're giving them enough credit, but the reason why you're not giving them enough credit is because you're pissed off that they acknowledged that Canelo Alvarez was a great fighter. And it's unfortunate because in return, you're really insulting that of black boxers. But anyway.
That the race fans approve, because the majority of boxing fans are race fans, unfortunately. And yet, while they're looking for,
I would agree, 99%, or at least a good 90% of boxing fans, possibly even sports fans, they overall will be racially motivated, especially that of boxing fans or that of the fight world. It just is what it is because it's an individual sport, so there's more pride there. But Dante, you're just as big of a racial, issue, dude, as the next guy. It just is what it is.
their approval, black fighters like Clarissa Shields, Andre Ward, Shakur Stevenson, Devin Haney, just all of them, they continue to get completely disrespected by the same group of fans that they are, as Andre Ward will put it, agreeing with.
Right. So because Andre Ward and because those black fighters, because they end up getting disrespected by racist fans, that means that they should turn into an emotional bitch boy like you overall with your bullshit agendas, and they overall should turn into another racially motivated person. When you see someone overall do bad, or when you see someone overall coming out with a bullshit false narrative, you don't reciprocate that overall with the same another false narrative. You reciprocate that overall by giving a logical and objective take and giving credit where credit is due. Dante, unfortunately, and I understand his point, but Dante, unfortunately, he's just another emotional fanboy who basically overall wants the certain racists to love him and to love his fighters. And that's just not going to happen. It is what it is. After a while, you realize certain people don't like you. It just is what it is. You have to move on from it. Dante, overall, he's over emotional and he wishes overall that the racists would love him and his fighters. It ain't gonna happen. All right, so it is what it is. Anyway.
Water, he loses to Tyson Fury. And I didn't hear Clarissa Shields come out and say, stop hating on Deontay Wilder. All those racist fans from America that were celebrating Deontay Wilder losing. Not one comment from Clarissa saying stop hating. After Canelo lost to Bivol, Mike Tyson went out of his way to make a video trying to give Canelo Alvarez tips on what he could do better in the rematch to beat Bivol. But yet we didn't see any of these videos of Mike Tyson giving Deontay Wilder tips after the first, second, or third fight.
Well, Mike Tyson overall seems to be jealous, at least in my view, over certain fighters of this day. And I think the reason why that is because Mike Tyson does not believe that he accomplished what he probably should have or could have within his career. Because that is not the only fighter that he's hated on or that he seems to have been jealous of. He's also seeming to have been jealous over that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. But anyway.
Against Tyson Fury. We didn't see these type of videos from Mike Tyson because he never put them out. Because they feel it is more accepted to help out Canelo Alvarez, make him feel better after a loss. Tell people to stop hating on Canelo Alvarez because he lost. These black fighters, they know if you say something like that, they're definitely going to receive less racist comments from the race fans, at least for the.
Well, Dante, if they're allegedly receiving all these goddamn racist comments, and that's not me, denying anything, because of course you're going to receive racial comments, really no matter what demographic you are, but especially black athletes. If we just want to, talk about that, you tell me that they receive racist comments all the goddamn time, so they eventually just crawl into their shell and they don't want to deal with it anymore. Is that why Devin Haney and Shakur Stevenson and Terrence Crawford all alleged a racial issue with the sport of boxing and Bob Arum? Wouldn't you think that that would even cause them to get more hate? So once again, are they saying this about Canelo Alvarez because they just can't stand the racists anymore, or are they doing this because they truly believe that? Once again, it just does not make any sense to me how eventually, just the pressure just gets to them when they've said several things about a racial issue about boxing in the past. That doesn't make any goddamn sense. That's like saying overall Malcolm X, back in whenever time he was around. That's like saying all in all, eventually he just couldn't handle the racists anymore, and eventually he just moved on overall from the movement. Like that, that just doesn't make any goddamn sense. It is what it is. Anyway,
Next week or two, until that story gets old.
at least someone who has shown such consistent behavior in the past to allege certain racial issues, and then all of a sudden just just not do it. Shakur Stevenson also recently said something about Tyson Fury because he realizes that Tyson Fury also is another great fighter. And of course, Dante tried to allege the same bullshit about Tyson Fury. No, the reason why Shakur Stevenson said something positive about both Canelo and Tyson Fury is because he realizes overall that he's a great fighter. And Shakur Stevenson does not overall put his mind on an over emotional level. He views things from a logical and objective perspective. Okay? So it is what it is.
One of these black fighters have another fight scheduled, especially if it's scheduled against an opponent who's not black, then everything goes back to normal when it comes to the comments. Listen, when it comes to Andre Ward going out of his way to say Canelo Alvarez is still pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world, how can Canelo Alvarez be still considered pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world when he's not the best fighter at light heavyweight? He's not the best fighter at 168 because you have David Benavidez there. Someone.
Please, Dante, and he's been trying to allege this bullshit for such a long time. Yet this is the same dude who will put Jamal Charlo overall on a top 10 pound for pound list. If you had Errol Spence and Terrence Bud Crawford fight, and if one of them lose, which because one of them is going to have to lose, would you not still have both of them on your top 10 pound for pound list? Let's stop fucking around, Dante. And you still have Jamel Charlo, not even within your top 10. You have him apparently within your top 5 pound for pound, even though he lost to that C-grade fighter, Tony Harrison, who never even won a belt and was knocked out in every single championship fight that he was in before Jamel Charlo. But anyway.
Who Canelo most likely won't fight. Listen, this is not like the UFC middleweight champion, Israel Adesanya, trying to move up to light heavyweight, losing there, coming back down in middleweight, and he's still the best fighter in his division. He's still taking on.
How do you have all the belts within your division, but you're not the best fighter there? like, come on. It just is what it is. Now, some people may say, well, David Benavidez, he might be a step ahead of those guys. David Benavidez, in my opinion, even though he's very physically talented, he has a lot of flaws in terms of his skills. He just gets hit way too often, in my opinion, and he doesn't have an A-grade defense. I mean, yeah, he looked very impressive against David Lemieux, but I mean, did we really expect anything else? It just is what it is. Now, is that me saying that maybe David Benavidez would not defeat a Canelo Alvarez? Who knows? Especially taking a look at Canelo in his last performance. But, no, Canelo has to be counted as the best guy there. He defeated the Ring Magazine champion Callum Smith. He defeated the undefeated Billy Joe Saunders, and he also defeated Caleb Plant. Does David Benavidez have one win there that is as good as that? No, he doesn't. So it just is what it is. You can say whatever the hell that you want to. Devin Haney, for example, would have to be the best of 135. He never went through Gervonta Tank Davis. He never went through Ryan Garcia or Vasily Lomachenko or Teofimo Lopez. He probably went through the weakest champion there. But at the end of the day, Devin Haney has to be counted as the best of 135. You have no problem calling Devin Haney the best of 135. I wonder why that is.
All of the best challengers. He's taking on the number one contenders. He's not vacating his belts. Canelo Alvarez, he's not fighting David Benavidez, David Morrell. He avoided Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade for
He did not avoid no damn Jamal Charlo. Once again, for those of you that actually believe that Jamal Charlo is that big of a threat to Canelo, look at his fight against Matt Korobov. look at his fight against Austin Trout. Jamal Charlo is dog food for Canelo Alvarez. That's what he is. He is no real threat for Canelo Alvarez. Demetrius Bubo Andrade is a very good fighter as well. Canelo overall has seemed to, maybe think that he has been a tricky style in the past, and maybe overall that he's a little bit more trouble than what he's worth. You can maybe debate that with Demetrius Bubo Andrade and David Benavidez. Canelo's already said that he is going to face him eventually, but Canelo wanted to face Dimitri Bivol overall, and he apparently said that he will face Dimitri Bivol in a rematch after Gennady Triple G Golovkin. I don't know if that'll be the best idea, but we'll see what happens.
7 years now. And as soon as Canelo Alvarez steps up in competition, he gets completely dominated. Every single time Canelo Alvarez stepped up in competition and took on a tough challenge, he either flat out lost or the fight ended in controversy, where everyone felt the other guy won. Before the Bivol fight,
Yes, and Dante's Boxing Nation has been trying to allege this with a certain amount of Canelo Alvarez's opponents, that Canelo overall does not deserve credit for the Gennady Golovkin victories, and that he does not deserve the credit over Araceli Lara because those were such close fights and allegedly ended up in controversy. No, those were just close fights. Overall, a controversial fight is what the Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. versus Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker fight was. Controversy is what Sugar Ray Leonard versus Tommy Hearns the rematch was. Controversy is what Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder 1 was. Those are controversial fights. And I may even add Brian Gastano versus Jamel Charlo the first fight around. Maybe debatably. But when it comes down to it, all in all, those are controversial fights. But the reason why he's not giving Canelo credit for that is because he does not want him to be remembered as a great fighter. But he'll give, once again, he'll give no problem allegedly giving Andre Ward the clear decision over Sergey Kovalev, which I think that he won as well. But a lot of people thought that was controversial. How come you never bring up that one? Everyone always brings up how Jamel Charlo was very controversial against Brian Gastano. I thought that was a fight that Charlo clearly lost 8 rounds to 4. You give Jamel Charlo credit for that one. So how come all of a sudden, these fights, all of a sudden they count? Like, get your shit out of here.
He hasn't had a really, really tough, dangerous opponent in nearly 4 years. And as soon as he's forced to take an opponent that he didn't even want to fight, as soon as he's forced to take on a tough...
What do you mean overall that he didn't even want to fight? He purposely overall went up to 175 to face Dimitri Bivol. Anyway.
Challenge, he loses. How can a fighter like that be considered pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world?
Because Canelo Alvarez has defeated repeated A-grade champions. Canelo, he has fought a lot of A-grade champions. Callum Smith was not looked as just some pushover overall. In fact, even back then, a few years ago, Dante and Aki, they were giving credit to Caleb Plant, and they were giving credit to Callum Smith and fighters like Billy Joe Saunders until Canelo fought them. And that's how you know, all in all, that is a true hater. When someone is never going to give someone credit no matter what, and they change their storylines based on what happens. So that's how you know Dante. He's trying to feed you or spoon feed you a spoonful of shit anyway. But anyway.
I mean, who is he pound for pound better than? Caleb Plant? Billy Joe Saunders? Caleb Smith? Avni Yildirim? Because you can't even say he's pound for pound better than David Benavidez.
Yes, you can. Now, once again, they always use David Benavidez' name over that of a Canelo Alvarez, but notice they'll never have David Benavidez on the top 10 pound for pound list. They always use Artubitabeev and David Benavidez' name against Canelo Alvarez, but as soon as Artubitabeev shot up on that top 10 pound for pound list, all of a sudden they had a problem. So, once again, they'll use those fighters as pawns overall, just as certain, other demographics. They may use certain black athletes, lesser black athletes, against that of the top echelon black athletes in other sports. For example, it may be if Serena Williams, was competing in a tennis tournament against Naomi Osaka, they would cheer more for, Naomi Osaka against Serena Williams, just because Serena Williams is more accomplished. She's more of a threat. So it is what it is, at least in certain circumstances. It's the same thing with Dante's Boxing Nation. He'll use Dimitri Bivol name. He'll use Artur Beterbiev name. He'll use David Benavidez' name overall to destroy Canelo Alvarez. But if it comes to one of his fighters, all of a sudden those fighters mean nothing to him.
He would have to get in the ring and prove that. See, this is what Andre.
Another great example is Mr. Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury, he was using Tyson Fury to go against Anthony Joshua. Now, Anthony Joshua is a black fighter, but he's almost kind of like, if you hear overall of the certain pro-racial Caucasians behind the scenes, certain Caucasians overall, they like that of the brighter Caucasians. They may not like the darker Caucasians like that of the Greeks or that of the Italians when it comes down to, because they're looked at as darker, they're not looked at as high, as much a high class. That's kind of overall what Dante's Boxing Nation looks at the Brits. He does not like Anthony Joshua as much. But as soon as Tyson Fury defeated Deontay Wilder, all of a sudden he jumped ship, not only to Deontay Wilder's ship, as he always had been on, now all of a sudden he likes Anthony Joshua more than Tyson Fury as well. Because he never originally thought that Tyson Fury was going to be the main threat. But anyway.
He should have been saying. Andre Ward should have been saying, if Canelo Alvarez really wants to prove that he's pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world, why don't you fight Andre? Why don't you fight Jamal Charlo? Why don't you fight David Benavidez? It makes no sense to me.
So allegedly, Gervonta Tank Davis is apparently one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world because he fought two fighters that have never even been champions in their career. One that already had a loss on his record, and Pitbull, Isaac Pitbull Cruz, if you want to make that point. Apparently, that was a A-grade fight, and apparently facing Rolly Romero, who has some of the worst boxing skills that I've ever seen. Apparently, that's an A-grade win as well. And Mario Barrios, someone who was also never a legitimate champion in his career either, and does not have one A-grade win. Apparently, those are elite wins. And Terrence Crawford beating Jeff Horn and Mean Machine and Jose Benavidez, those are the real A-grade wins. But Canelo facing legitimate champions that have actual skills, like a Caleb Plant, a Billy Joe Saunders, or Callum Smith, or Danny Jacobs, those do not count. And don't forget, apparently the Gennady Golovkin and Aristotle Lara wins, they don't count because apparently they're just so ripe with controversy. But he does not keep the same energy with the first Tyson Fury Deontay Wilder fight or the Andre Ward Sergey Kovalev fights, or other certain fighters that he worships. But anyway.
Because Andre Ward was treated just like Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, and even Devin Haney. Old media protected Gennady Golovkin from Andre Ward just like they protected Canelo.
Gennady Golovkin is another pawn that they like to use now because Gennady Golovkin is no longer in the conversation as the number one pound for pound fighter. But believe it or not, back then, and I made a video about this a while ago, when Gennady Golovkin was looked to be superior to that of Canelo Alvarez, they then used Canelo Alvarez as the pawn to tear down Gennady Golovkin. So it's very obvious what Dante is all about. It just is what it is.
Alvarez from Andrade and Jamal Charlo. But Andre Ward, he isn't going to bring up any of these points because he knows this is not what the race fans want to hear in the sport. Something else Andre Ward said that really made no sense is when he said the fight wasn't a blowout. Did you guys know in the NBA, when a team wins by 20 points, they consider that a blowout? I mean, that's the exact word that they use. So it could be said that Bivol, he actually won 10 rounds to 2. That's a blow.
No, he didn't win 10 rounds to 2. He won 8 rounds to 4, but Dante really, he really overall doesn't score fights that intelligently anyway, unless it comes to one of his fighters. But anyway.
Wow. Andre Ward, he was saying, well, it's not like he got...
I would not say that it was a complete blowout, but it was very clear that Dimitri Bivol won the fight, because to me it was 8 rounds to 4. But anyway.
Knocked out and was completely out of the fight. It don't matter if it's a layup or a slam dunk. Both shots are worth 2 points. And there's no doubt about it that Bivol, he definitely beat Canelo Alvarez by 20 points in this fight.
No, he didn't beat him by 20 points, but he probably beat him by a good 10. Not a blowout, but clearly showing his superiority in this fight.
That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. Let me tell you guys about East.
But that's pretty much about it for this video. I just thought that I would review it because, once again, the main reason why I review these videos, especially by certain channels or by certain ESPN or, Fox Sports News areas, is because, most people really in general, especially in the sports world, they'll try to spoon feed you a bowl of shit. And at the end of the day, I like to put things in their proper perspective. No, these certain fighters do not overall say these things about Canelo just 100% of the time because they're just worried about the racial fans. Because there's been many times to where these certain fighters, black fighters, have spoken out about certain racial double standards. And then all of a sudden, now that they're talking about Canelo, they're afraid. That just doesn't make any sense. It is what it is. Anyway, I mean, not saying that that couldn't happen, but you're talking about certain fighters that have had consistent call outs of, racial behavior. So it is what it is. But anyway, but that's really about it for today. But the career of Canelo Alvarez is going to be very interesting preceding this. It's going to be very interesting to see how he handles that Gennady Golovkin trilogy and also what he does after that. But it's going to be very interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.